Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our latest LinkedIn Live. So we've got our regular guest, Andy Laws, co-founder of RevRocket. Sean is off on holiday somewhere nice, but we found somebody who we think is going to add some real great value to this session. We have Ross Keating, who's the founder of the Lennox Academy, one of the top live training platforms in EMEA, to today talk about a real critical topic. The title, a bit provocative, it's called Prevent Your SDRs from Being Part of the 55% of AEs who fail when promoted. Being an SDR and being an SDR leader, it's one of our two pieces about driving pipeline and also building a talent pipeline for the business. So we need to ensure that we're setting up these people for success. So that's going to be the theme of today's LinkedIn Live. I'm now going to let our two guests reintroduce themselves to the LinkedIn world. So, hey Ross, we'll turn it over to you. Give an introduction about yourself.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks, lads, for having me. So, as Dave said, I run a business called the Lennox Academy. So, the Lennox Academy is a sales training academy specifically designed to enable sales best practice and sales best practice from a process perspective in BDRs and AEs. So, we've got a really, really narrow focus on developing new business sales skills. And we do that through a range of different learning environments. So we do it through a variety of training courses and one-to-one coaching as well. In a previous life, I've done 2 VP of sales roles. So managing commercial arm of 2 early stage tech orgs. And I suppose relative to this conversation in building out BDR teams, AE teams, and also in managing SDR leaders as well. So delighted to be here. I think particularly important and relevant topic given current market dynamics and given kind of current tricky selling landscapes at the moment. So looking forward to getting into it.
Awesome. Andy, do you want to just reintroduce yourself as well to the public?
Yeah, of course. For those that maybe haven't come across me yet or heard me rattle on in one of these LinkedIn Lives, my name is Andy. I'm the co-founder of an organization called RevRocket Limited. We really are a consulting and advisory business supporting businesses, time poor VPs of sales and SDRs in building sustainable pipeline generation systems. So we help you generate more consistent, high quality pipeline.
Brilliant. So as ever, if people have questions, just drop them into the chat. We really want to make this as interactive as possible. So keep on adding in questions that you have for Ross and Andy, and we'll kick it off with a nice, easy question. Why do some SDRs fail as AEs? And Ross, why don't we start with you on this question?
Yeah, sure. So for me, when we think about the transition from SDR to AE, we think about core components of an AE role, right? And because everybody loves an acronym, we break it down into 3 simple steps, 3 Ps, which is plan, process, and pitch, right? And plan covers everything from fundamentally understanding my territory, account mapping, how do I set myself up for success within the CRM, through to as well, how do I fundamentally understand my metrics, right? So how do I understand things like my deal size, win rate, sales cycle, and again, build out that forward-looking funnel in order to understand how those metrics play out. Process covers things like what I do pre and post sales call. How do I maybe work through a deal framework, something like Medic? Do I leverage something like a mutual action plan? And the pitch element covers everything from discovery through pitch. And, when you get into the detail of that, everything from competitive discovery through multi-threading and all that other good stuff. But to answer your question directly, I think we spend too much time preparing reps for the pitch element of the role, so for what they do in a prospect or customer facing scenario, I think most salespeople, given their natural disposition, are going to be, gearing up for that aspect of the role anyway. And I think that we certainly in a lot of programs that I've seen, we maybe just don't give enough support and exposure to BDRs and SDRs coming through that talent pipeline in how they're going to prepare for the planning elements and the process elements that I mentioned there.
No, that's really interesting insight there on that piece. Andy, is there anything else from your side that you feel is the reasons why SDRs are failing as AEs?
Yeah, firstly, I think that's a really interesting observation from Ross with his experience. If I zoom out and just look at it from a more macro perspective, I think there's this well, firstly, let's address your question, which is why do some SDRs fail as AEs? Let's just look at that statistic that we're addressing here, which is 55% of AEs who fail, or SDRs who become AEs of failing. That's not some, right? That's a lot. So I think the kind of macro perspective I have is there's this unhealthy cocktail of overly ambitious SDRs, which I get. People want to progress their career and progress their career quickly, but trying to obviously do it too quickly without learning and developing the foundations required. And then failure on an organizational side and from a leadership side to make sure that actually, to Ross's point, we're equipping them with a roadmap of development that is going to give them all of the necessary skills to be able to go on and be successful in that next role. And invariably, where that failure rate is high is probably because there is this unhealthy mix and a very sizable jump that is being asked of the SDR or the XDR to then move into that AE role without actually the enablement that they need.
And just to build on that as well, because I think it's a really good point. And again, kind of bearing in mind a lot of people watching today are going to be SDR leaders, right? There is a structural gap in our industry in terms of tangible skill set development. And a lot of that is the product of the environment that we have just come out of, right? So we were living in an economic environment where SaaS was about growth at all costs and tech was sexy and budgets were big and tech consolidation was not a subject line, for a VP of sales or for a head of RevOps. And the product of that was about how do we drive volume through our sales funnel. And obviously then we meet a downturn fairly quickly. There's a whole generation of reps out there that just maybe haven't had the support and haven't had the experience selling into more complex environments. So haven't had to manage more complex sales cycles, haven't had to deal in negotiation situations with CFOs, right? Haven't had to manage much more competitive selling environments. And we have a bit of a way to go, I think, in covering that structural gap so that we can actively support BDRs coming through into this newer environment.
I think you're totally right there, especially on the piece of where we've just come out of in terms of professional development. That we do see that a lot in terms of how not anybody's fault per se, and there's been a limiting factor in terms of professional development because of COVID. And we're now starting to see that those people that were hired post-COVID are accelerating faster than those who were hired within COVID. It's a really interesting point. We've kind of touched on this next question a little bit already, but if there is any particular place you want to double click on in those areas of difference between SDRs and AEs, is there any kind of specific areas that you're seeing where the SDRs are failing?
Yeah, certainly. So from my perspective, I hate to hear AE managers saying that the gap is closing experience, right? Because that's this kind of broad catch-all term that again doesn't break down the components of the AE role, right? So I'll stick with the 3 Ps that I've given you, right? I see the planning piece to be fundamentally different at an AE level, naturally, right? You're going from managing one part of the sales cycle to managing the entire sales cycle. And it's very rare that I see SDRs equipped with the skills to go into a quarter or a half year or a year where they actively know how to build a plan that says, here's my quota, here's how I reverse engineer all of my metrics from that quota, and then understanding what the different metrics that I need to hit are. How do I then go and tackle an account base or a territory, right? Like, if you haven't tackled a territory for the first time, I often see SDRs going in and saying, hey, look, there's loads of white space over here, right? There's loads of opportunity here where my organization hasn't got a footprint in that territory. And the reality is that there's a reason your organization hasn't got a footprint in that territory. You've got to go through a whole education process with the prospect. It's an entirely different sales process. But if you've been equipped with the skills to prepare for that, you go in, you know how to build a funnel, you know how to structure your territory or your account base, then you're naturally setting yourself up for success, right? And even if your win rates are a little bit lower, your deal size is a little bit lower versus a more established AE, you can prospect your way out of some of those metrics, assuming that you're prospecting into the right spaces. So for me, again, we're going to have BDRs who are regularly on the phone, who are used to engaging with prospects. We have to better enable talent coming through in some of those more mechanical pieces that are, in some cases, a bigger variable in the success of the role.
Interesting. That's a really interesting point. Andy, is there anything else you can add to that? Any particular area?
Yeah, I think there's probably a couple of things that I would just double down on with what Ross has said there, right? Which is, depending on how your SDR or XDR organization is set up, some organizations are, fielding inbounds and, doing qualification and passing them on pretty quickly. There's other organizations that maybe have an outbound motion, but it's, appointment setting, and then it's passed over to an account executive. Like, the exposure to whatever your sales process is in the stages that exists after an opportunity is qualified or after an appointment set, if there's no exposure to the rest of that sales cycle, like, the requirements of that SDR or that XDR are going to be that much greater, right? So there is an onus over time to think about how you get those reps that exposure, or evenly be even more strategic about, how is it that we're setting our SDR or XDR organization up in terms of their responsibilities on a day-to-day basis. Do we just want them to book appointments, or actually do we want to get them into a position where they're doing that outbound, or they're fielding the inbound, they're doing the qualification, maybe they have to do the first demo and then it goes to the account executives, right? Like, there's lots of different ways that you can have consideration for kind of like stretching the development and getting that person closer to readiness even before we have the conversation around career development and making that step. The second thing I would say is, go through, as either if you're an SDR leader on this call, like, go and sit with whoever the VP of sales or the hiring sales leadership are and map out all of the requirements of the job spec that is needed of an account executive, and then sit down at the point at which you're having that career development conversation with the XDR and say, right, okay, let's color code these from green, amber, and red. Which of these criteria are you absolutely 100% solid on? Which of these have you had some exposure to and have some confidence in, but some work? And which of this stuff have you never done before, right? And then once you've got that exercise, you can then start to map forwards as to where do we need to spend our time to go through that development process and touch on some of the things that Ross alluded to earlier.
No, it's a really good point. And let's change gears a little bit, because we've spoken a lot about where has it not worked. So let's talk about where it has worked. So Ross, question for you to start off with. What are some of the best organizations you've seen that have built out an SDR to AE development program?
So I'll give a few shout outs to companies like HubSpot, Gong. We've gotten to know the team at LearnUpon recently, who have a lot of former BDRs in their AE ranks. But the organization that stands out for me is Wayflyer, and we spent a lot of time with the Wayflyer team, and they have built, well, firstly, they've built a high functioning BDR organization, right? which naturally has best-in-class standards within that organization, and they've hired really well from a talent perspective into the BDR ranks. But they've then built an AE readiness program, right? And it does a lot of the things that Andy has really nicely articulated there, which is gives BDRs exposure to skills and environments that they're going to need at AE level, right? And just to be clear on that, that is a product of a number of things. It's a product of good BDR leadership. It's a product of good collaboration between BDR leadership and AE leadership. It's a product of very good enablement or L&D support and planning. And they've also leveraged our services as an external provider to come in and provide additional support in terms of those really tangible skill sets. So, like anything, putting a structure and pulling all of the stakeholders that should be involved into a program like this is where it really works. And again, Wayflyer, on the back of that strong readiness program, have a high number of former BDRs in their AE ranks. But most importantly, it's those reps that are typically outperforming, or in a lot of cases, let's say, are outperforming external hires as well.
Yeah, I just think one that I would love to add on that is the Snowflake program as well, the SDR to the CAE, corporate account exec function. It's really interlocked that function. You see the readiness program that Snowflake had built out for talent that they believe are going to become CAEs, that training program. Then there's another training program then, once they've passed that kind of foundations, to then build out more of a muscle in terms of how to run calls and things of that nature, so that then it's just this natural seamless progression from that SDR to a CAE role. And there was a really interesting stat that no SDR in EMEA, at least, had been let go as a CAE at Snowflake that came through from the SDR ranks, because they just the program had worked so seamlessly.
Let me steal Dave's job for a second and ask this question of both of you then, which is, there are organizations that have these development pathways and an enablement series for that readiness phase. What's the trigger point and eligibility criteria that then means companies are putting these people through this roadmap? Because I know Klaviyo do this as well, but I think there's probably some leaders on here which are like, right, okay, what are the signs and how do we benchmark those people that we deem to be ready to take that step into that enablement process?
Let you go first, Ross.
Yeah, so from my perspective, I'll tell you what it is and I'll tell you what's not. What it is performance. Firstly, you get BDR performance under your belt, you get consistent BDR performance under your belt. And what it's not for me is tenure, right? And I think some organizations get that wrong. And the other variable is what you've alluded to, Andy, right? So it is that the BDR has gone through the learning path, right? So it is that the BDR has completed, or like for me, a BDR should never go into an AE role having not done everything that an AE does, right? And that includes closing a deal. Now, that may not be possible in every organization, right? But it is the high-performing BDR who has performance under their belt, is naturally and organically starting to take on additional responsibilities, and then after that has completed a structured learning path that gives them experience and exposure covering every aspect of the AE role.
So yeah, on my side, there is a tenure piece, because the return of investment of an SDR, we only really start to see that after about 6 months or so. So it's like maybe 4 solid four fully ramped quarters of an SDR in seat before we start getting them into that next stage of the career development piece. And then that's another 3 months, another quarter. And then, so really we're looking at somebody who's been in seat for about 18 months altogether. And then we also had really, and I mean really, like delta, if you didn't hit your number or you didn't average your number, you weren't eligible to be promoted. And so we were seeing people who were a couple of percentage points off, just not getting promoted that quarter. But that was to really ensure that quality and that continuous pursuit of excellence as well.
My question was loaded because I have a pretty strong opinion on this, and it sounds like we all breathe the same air on this, which is having some form of standardized, articulated, well communicated promotion passport type thing, I think is important, right? And whether you agree or disagree on inclusivity of tenure in that, and then obviously you've got the attainment piece. So, is it back-to-back quarters or X number of months hitting quota, or to your point, Dave, like you need to withhold or upkeep a certain percentage attainment over a period of time? Do you need to have X amount of close one business sourced during that time too? Like there's all sorts of different things that you can have a perspective on, but then at least the reps know what they need to work towards. You've got confidence that, to Ross's point, they're going to have the tenure in the SDR role that's going to give them that exposure to all of those elements. And it makes the expectation management piece easier as well from a leadership standpoint.
Yeah, great point. We're coming close to the end. We're coming to the back straight, and I want to make sure that we get some of these questions answered. So I'm gonna come down to our final question, and then we'll open it up to people on the live feed. And Ross, we'll start with you with this one. What's the one impactful, actionable tactic that a leader who's on this call should implement tomorrow in building out the promotion pathway for their org?
Yeah, I'm going to keep beating the same drum that I have been on this call, right? And that is that we enable team members on all of the core competencies rather than the ones that are just prospect facing, right? So if I'm an SDR leader and I want to get an SDR ready for an AE role, I create a structured learning path with a clear paper trail of all of the experience and exposure that SDR gets to the skills and environments that they are going to be tackling as an AE, right? And in a perfect world, I have an SDR managing a couple of deals and closing a deal. That may not be possible, but what I can do is I can create simulated exercises, right? So in the past, I have worked through plans with SDR leaders and SDRs themselves where they do mock territory plans and they build mock sales funnels, and you can create challenging deal environments. You can create exercises for them to do from a planning perspective, again, which is offline. And the interview that the SDR goes through with the AE should be a rubber stamp of approval and less of a test of competency. And the way that you do that is by creating that paper trail, building the relationship with the AE manager, both at leadership level and rep to leader. And they go in and they show the skills they've acquired rather than they kind of be put through the mill and tested.
Great, that's great. Great idea and tactic. Andy, what's yours? What's the one impactful, actionable tactic everybody should take away from this call?
I mean, I can't steer too far different from what Ross has spoken to there. I think if you don't have something that's down on paper where it's line item by line item as to the core competencies that rep firstly needs to get exposure to, but then display the competency, right? And whether it's a case of there are certifications that accompany certain elements, whether it be discovery certification, advanced demo certification, mutual action plan certificate, like however you want to do it, like making sure that you've got that rubber stamp on those key competencies through different phases of the sales cycle are important. And depending on the maturation of your organization, making sure that you're totally aligned with whoever the sales leadership is. If you've got an enablement or L&D function, making sure that they're brought into it. and understanding then who's having ownership over which components of that delivery as well. Is it going to be entirely enablement and L&D owned, and actually, you and the sales leader are periodically going to come in and take a look and trust that process is going to be handled effectively, or actually, does it need to be shared more equally, or does the sales side of things need to take more ownership over it, right? So just making sure you've got that interdepartmental connectivity, I think, is important when you think about building it out and also executing against that development plan.
Great. So, well, thank you both. Let's open it up to the questions. So we've got 4 minutes left. So keep your answers, Andy and Ross, super succinct, so we can get through all the questions. So, well, Andy, this one was addressed to you. So it's from Craig. What does the roadmap from SDR to AE look like to you in a elevator pitch?
I think we've covered a lot of it in this call, hopefully, Craig. I think within your organization, outlining what does the sales cycle look like, and what are the core competencies that then come with that, and then mapping that out and understanding, is this a green, red, or an amber in terms of the rep's capabilities, and then just systematically working through what's required to move those amber and those reds into the green, right? And then whose support do you need? Is that an enablement thing? Is that a shadowing of current account executives? Is that working with sales leadership to fulfill certain things? So I don't think it's necessarily one size fits all. But I think there's probably some things that you can track and standardize in there as well.
Ross, let's move to you. Let's see if you can answer this question from Matthew. Do you feel that training and quality of teams are a thing of the past post-COVID? And yeah, it'd be interesting to get your take on that. Do you feel that the training and quality of teams are a thing of the past?
No, I don't. I mean, I certainly, as I alluded to earlier, think that we are operating in a very different environment, and a different environment, maybe requires different delivery and different communication with a different generation of reps, right? But the core competencies that a BDR needs in order to move to account executive has not fundamentally changed, right? I mean, aside from the kind of market dynamics, a good salesperson, whether they're selling SaaS now or we're selling 10 or 15 years ago, it's still about those same strong sales and communication skills, right? And that requires good training. I do think, as I said earlier, that there is a structural gap in terms of the quality maybe of enablement in some organizations, not all organizations, that is being offered to reps. And I think as well, maybe that there's a cohort of first line managers who were sales people over the last number of years, who again maybe didn't get the support themselves from leaders, or didn't need the support from leaders, and that probably is something that has to be addressed as well.
Great, thank you, Ross. So it looks like we're running out of time here. So just wanted to thank Andy once again for coming. And also, Ross, thanks ever so much for coming and being our special guest today. If anybody has any other questions, please just add it into the comments, into the LinkedIn Live, and I'm sure Ross and Andy will see that and can be able to answer them for you as we move forward. So for now, thank you so much and have a great rest of the week. Goodbye.